One of the more challenging answers in the test could be your explaining the key differences between the approaches. And so this is required to achieve these 6 credits. And so let's look at how we can do that. All right, so you're going to get questions that might look like this. How is the evolutionary approach different from the biological? How are the biological and evolutionary different from the socio-cultural? I think I might even say choose 2 approaches and contrast them. Choose a different 2 approaches and contrast them here. It might make it easier. But anyway, I'll make it as easy as I can. But the key is that you have to contrast the approaches. Now, the trickiest one is probably biological psychology versus evolutionary psychology because there's so much overlap. Now, we've been through this in class, but I wanted to make this video here for anyone that missed it or was asleep. So we have Lisa Welling, and we could say she's a biological psychologist because she's looking at the role of sex hormones in attraction. She has the video, It's Not You, It's My Hormones. And David Buss is arguably the most famous evolutionary psychologist who studies attraction. And so in order to, it's really important that we personify these approaches because when we talk about the approaches in psychology, we're talking about these people, these psychologists that take these approaches. So we have to think about the key differences in what they think about human behavior and how they study it. That's what we're trying to contrast. So Lisa Welling and other biological psychologists, they, in their research, start with the biological factors and they see how they affect behavior. So they'll change people's hormones and then measure their attraction. David Buss and evolutionary psychologists, they start with the behavior first and then they work backwards and see how it might be because of evolution. So they go and find out what people find attractive and then explain it from an evolutionary point of view. Here, Lisa Welling starts with the biology and then goes and see if it influences attraction. So hopefully you can see they're a bit opposite in that process. The biological psychologists are focused more on short-term processes. Changes in hormone levels happen over a relatively short term. Changes in neurotransmitters, and so you could argue that they look at short-term biological changes and how they affect behavior, whereas evolution is a very long process over thousands of years, so they focus more on long-term processes. The biological psychology, that approach looks at factors that can be measured in a lab, like your hormone levels and activity in your brain, whereas evolution, these are processes which often are immeasurable because, well, and we could measure them potentially, but that would be very, very difficult and it would take a long, long time. So we've got measured versus immeasurable. And the biological approach, and I think this is the key difference for me, is that biological psychology focuses on specific factors, very specific hormones, areas of the brain, specific genes, whereas evolutionary psychology typically tends to just have a very general explanation which is about how behaviors help us to survive. It doesn't generally go into the specifics. And it's important to note that most, or a lot of curriculums link evolutionary psychology as part of biological psychology, and so this is just seen as a subset of biological psychology. Okay, and we could say that biological psychology is focused on the present, okay, what's happening right now in our bodies, whereas evolutionary psychology is focused on the past. So you only really need to have one difference. I would probably choose 2 of those that make sense to you, and you can contrast the biological psychologist with the evolutionary psychologist, and I hope that helps. Okay, and here's an example from the studies, right? So she changed people's hormones in a measurable way to see the short-term changes, to see what we find attractive in the present, whereas Buss, he looked at over 10,000 people and found out what they found attractive, worked backwards, and then gave explanations based on the past and long-term processes, which we can't measure. All right, you don't need to give the examples. These are just to help illustrate what I've just explained. Now, let's look at contrasting with the sociocultural psychologists. So here are some more famous biological psychologists, Ledoux, Rain, Sapolsky, Crockett, and they all use a biological approach. So what do they mean? They are assuming that our behavior is because of biological factors. These are internal and they're focused on nature, right? They're looking at the nature side of the nature versus nurture argument. That's their fundamental assumption. All right, and so what tools do they use to measure those? We just talked about those a little bit, but they would be measuring things like brain activity with fMRI scans and hormone levels with blood samples and saliva samples. So that's about what a biological approach looks like. Now, if we contrast that with the sociocultural psychologists, these people will use the sociocultural approach. They look at, Tajfel looked at how groups affect our conformity, our prejudice. This guy, Solomon Asch looked at conformity, Bandura looked at social learning, and Michael Marmot looked at how inequalities affect our health. Okay, so what do they assume? Well, they're assuming that our behavior, whether it's aggression or conformity or prejudice, are based on our environment, the people around us, right, and the world around us. These are external factors focused on nurture. Okay, this is the fundamental assumption of the social cultural approach. Now, to measure these, the tools they use are often things like direct observations or questionnaires. So a bit different to the biological approach, because you can't directly observe. Bandura had an observation in a laboratory. You can't directly observe someone's biology. You've got to measure it in some way. Ash had an experiment where he could see the conformity. You can't really do that in a biological study. So if we contrast the biological and evolutionary approaches with the socio-cultural, we could look at the biological evolutionary focus on internal factors, and they're focused mainly on the nature side of the nature versus nurture argument. Whereas the social cultural approach is looking more at external factors like social media and social learning, and they focus more on the nurture side. Now these 2 points should be pretty straightforward. This is all I'm asking you to do to contrast these two approaches. You could also say that the biological and evolutionary approaches focus more on direct measures, so they go and measure directly, specifically. They get facts, numbers, figures, based on your hormone levels, your brain activity, what's going on. Whereas the social cultural approach is often used more self-report or observation. So they have different fundamental beliefs in what's causing behavior, and they're measuring different things using different tools. Okay, and these are some terms that you can use to explain those differences. I really don't like this question in this assignment, in this internal, contrasting the approaches. I think it's silly. I think because really the approaches are arbitrary constructs that kind of really don't exist in real psychology out there in the real world. They're sort of things we make up to help us make sense of what different psychologists do, and they all use sort of the same methods. It just depends on what they want to achieve. But anyway, these are the hoops we have to jump through, so this is why I'm spelling it out for you, nice and plain and simple. I hope that was helpful.